Okay. Well, so everybody, thank you for coming to this presentation titled 20 Hours to 30 Minutes One Nonprofit's Tech Transformation Story. I'm your MC, Susanna Erler, and I'm a volunteer organizer for the Austin chapter of TechSoup Connect. TechSoup Connect is a global network of chapters hosted by volunteers like me who offer free online and in person events about tech for good. And I'll share the link for ways to contact us and learn more about the chapter and TechSoup. In a moment, I'll share that. And also know that we are recording this to upload to YouTube. I'll share the link for where to find this and other presentations on the TechSoup channel. I'll share that link in a moment. And thanks again for coming to today's wonderful presentation. We're so thrilled to have an expert in implementing technology changes with us to share her knowledge, and everyone know that there will be a Q&A at the end, and if anybody wants the slides, Laura will share her contact information and you can reach out to her for the slides. So here's the description of what you saw when you signed up. 20 hours to 30 minutes, one nonprofit's tech transformation story. Discover how one nonprofit transformed their crisis response time from 20 hours to just 30 minutes and secured new funding in the process. Our esteemed presenter is Laura Leonard. She is the founder and principal consultant at Good Egg Solutions. I'll put their link in the chat as well, partnering with nonprofits to turn technology investments into measurable mission outcomes. Laura has 15 years of Fortune 500 experience implementing successful technology changes. She holds a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Rice University and an MBA from the University of Michigan with a specialization in global operations management and continuous improvement. So please give your best virtual platform welcome to Laura Leonard. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you, Susanna. Great. Well, I mean, you just did a fantastic introduction. So I was going to start by introducing myself, but it was wonderful. But I'm Laura. I'm the founder and principal consultant at Good Egg Solutions, and we help nonprofits manage the people and the process side of their technology changes so that their investments pay off, like Susanna was saying. So whether it's moving beyond spreadsheets or changing to a new client or donor or grant management system, we can help ensure that your technology serves your mission instead of complicating it. So I've included a few QR codes here, and I invite you to follow Good Egg Solutions and connect with me personally on LinkedIn. As Susanna said, there's going to be some time for questions at the end. But I am all about a growth mindset. So please feel free to email me directly with questions or feedback anytime after the session. So this is an open door, open communications. Great. Well, let's dive into it then. All right. Whoop, sorry. Back it up. Okay. Spooky. I threw this graph in because usually when I say that I help nonprofits with change management, I hear people immediately saying that they have some horror story around a tech implementation that has gone wrong. So I bet there's a few of you on the call today that have some of those ideas of terrible experiences that are percolating in there. So if anybody wants to come off mute and share, you're welcome to share your horror story. I'll give everybody just a couple seconds to see if they are brave enough to come off mute and share a situation where their tech did not work out as anticipated. All right, I didn't think so. Not everybody's brave at the top of a meeting. I understand. But as I said, I have an arsenal of these because whenever I talk to people share their stories. So just the other day, I was talking to somebody who told me how their nonprofit had spent tens of thousands of dollars to replace their old system of spreadsheets with Salesforce. And unfortunately, they didn't give as much consideration to the people side as they should have. And so, unsurprisingly, because they didn't work on changing with the people never changed. And so, 3 years later, the organization was still using those spreadsheets instead of using Salesforce. And it was just a frustrating waste of time and money. And although I hear these anecdotes all the time, I still find the data really powerful. So, what do the numbers say? According to N10's 2024 Digital Investment Report, nonprofits spend about 68 times more on technology investments than on ensuring their success. So, is it any wonder that roughly 70% of technology change projects fail to deliver on their expectations? It's a pretty dreary picture, but it doesn't have to be. By the end of our session today, you're going to be familiar with some of the key steps you need to consider as you prepare your organization for any technology change. So let's get started. At the highest level, there are 3 phases to making a change so that the technology that you're putting in place serves your mission instead of complicating it. So, first is preparing for the change, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Then it's actually implementing the change, moving your data over, starting to use those new systems. And finally, a very frequently overlooked stage is improving upon that change, looking back and seeing whether what you planned for is actually working as intended, and then putting in tweaks and iterations to fix what needs to be fixed. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to do a deep dive on preparing for that change, and it's going to be through an illustrative case study of an organization called Women Rising. So, let's get introduced. Meet Women Rising. They support women in crisis by providing the tools to break the cycle of abuse and poverty. They offer an array of services, including violence counseling, housing assistance, career services, and a shelter for women and their families. And when we began our engagement, they were serving about 9,500 individuals annually, and their operating budget was about $2.8 million. And they had a problem. They were the referring agency for the Jersey City Police Department for domestic violence victims. So periodically, the police department would call them and ask for information like, hey, what services had you provided to a specific client after her last referral? And the folks at Women Rising would have to go find that information across dozens of filing cabinets with information organized in all different ways. At its worst, one of the employees told me that for a particular client, it took her up to 20 employee hours to track down a complete picture of the services that they'd provided to that client because she was chasing this information across several departments. It was a really frustratingly inefficient use of their time, and they knew that they needed a better solution. So, in collaboration with their board, they decided to upgrade from their old filing system to Salesforce. And I imagine that everybody here on this call is familiar with Salesforce, but if not, it is a robust, enterprise grade software that helps organizations manage their client data. And Women Rising knew that Salesforce had the potential to drastically improve their efficiency. But how could they avoid being part of that 70% of tech change projects that flop? Well, they recognized the need for support in managing this huge technology leap forward. And so that's when our engagement began. So let's take a look at some of the best practices that help them prepare for a successful change. So remember that there's 3 steps. There's preparing for the change, there's actually implementing it, and then there's improving it. So here's some key steps to prepare for a big change, like making a leap to Salesforce. And just a heads up, we'll be spending the next few slides walking through the theory and best practices behind these steps. And then we'll look at what it looked like in our real world example at Women Rising. Okay, so the steps are you need to identify who your stakeholders are. Then you need to collect data about what's happening today. You need to pull that information together to document how things are, your current state. And then analyze that to determine what it should be in the future. If it's sounding pretty straightforward, that's good. It's not rocket science. We can do this. So let's look at all the steps in a little bit more detail. The first step in preparing for your change is identifying who are your stakeholders. So your objective here is to come up with a list of the top, depending on the size of your organization and the change, say 5 to 15 people that you need to be engaging with. And these folks are going to help you ensure that whatever solution you're putting together will meet the needs of the organization once it's in place. So how do you pick who those folks are? Just like for everything else in life, representation matters in change management too. Here's a few key factors to consider when coming up with your list of stakeholders. So first, different levels in the organization. You want some folks at the executive level, perhaps even on the board. You want some folks certainly who are doing whatever your frontline work is. And also, if you have any management levels in between, you want that represented. You may also want to include the voice of volunteers or even clients. You want to include different key departments. So, for instance, if each program has its own team, you want representation from at least the key program teams. You also want to consider different identities and ways of working. So, just like any other project, you want to ensure that your stakeholders span different identities like racial and ethnic minorities, or folks for whom English is a second language, or people with disabilities. And that is a really helpful one to include in tech because people who require accommodations always have a really helpful sense of how to make technology more accessible for everyone. You can also think about identity in terms of how people work. So we all know the people in an organization or in life who are real gung-ho about a new technology and ready to just dig into it. And then you have some folks who are a little bit slower to adopt things. And so ideally you want a good smattering of different people so that you can plan for the people who are eager and also the people who are reticent. And then I like to do a final check in terms of inputs and outputs. So if you take a look at the image, you've got some folks in your organization who, as a part of their jobs, will be collecting information. And you're going to put that into whatever your technology tool is. And then you have some folks who are going to be pulling information out of that technology tool to do their jobs. And remember, those people could be internal to your organization, but it could also be board members or maybe even partner organizations that need information from you. So I think this kind of systems level approach of input and output is helpful to do kind of just a double check. Did you get all your bases covered? Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to think about representation, but remember your objective here is to come up with a short list of people you need to engage with so that you have a better understanding of the needs that your technology needs to help meet for your organization. All right. The next step in preparing for your change is to collect data. And one of the best ways to do this is via interviews or focus groups with those stakeholders. So, because we were intentional about choosing a representative group, we're going to form a 360-degree picture of what's happening today in the organization. How does work get done? What is working well? What needs improved? Does the data that you have say? So remember that as you're talking to people, which I think will probably in most organizations be your main means of collecting data, as if you're putting in a new system, you probably don't have a lot of existing valuable data to use. But remember, as you're talking to these folks, they will be a source of qualitative data, like walk me through how this task gets done. But they also will be the ones who have access to any of that quantitative data. So past stats in terms of the number of people served, or historic survey results, or reports, anything that you previously put together, it's a good time to actually ask for that information. So the second step is collecting all that data on how things are done today. Then you're ready to document your current state. Now, you may be thinking, why would you waste your time on talking about how things are today if you're looking to change how they are in the future anyway? And that's a really great question. If you're putting in a new technology and part of the purpose is to improve the way that things are done, then you have to have an understanding of how things are done today. Because otherwise, how will you improve upon it? How will you communicate the changes that need to be made? And how will you see progress to make sure that you actually made those improvements? So, documenting the current state provides kind of a clear baseline that everyone can buy into and understand on how things stand today. Okay, so I've harped on the importance of it, but what does documenting your current state actually mean? Well, here's a few best practices to help you paint that picture. One thing you can do is create visuals that capture how tasks get done or how information moves through your organization. And you don't have to be too perfect about it. Just literally start making boxes in a Google slide or lining up sticky notes on a whiteboard and say, like, okay, well, what happens next? It's just helpful to get everything where everyone can see it and weigh into it. And once you've got a few visuals of the key processes or information flows, you can enrich that picture by adding any quantitative information you have. So, some examples of useful quantitative information may include, like, how long does it take for a client to get from, one step in a process, like say registering, to the next step, say getting an appointment for something, if you have that information. Another piece of information would be the number of clients served by program or by day. Or if you're looking at a data set, you could say, like, hey, how many of these client records are missing certain info? So it's helpful to kind of pull together as much quantitative information onto that visualization of a process or an information flow as possible so you can generate a total picture. And finally, you want to summarize the challenges that you're hearing and seeing in the data. So often you'll see a pattern where multiple roles are experiencing similar challenges, and you can say, like, hey, this is like a real big pain point in our organization. And remember, the point of this exercise is to be able to see and communicate how things run today so that no one's making assumptions and everybody can be on the same page as you move forward. And this will be really helpful in the implementation step as you are communicating about this change. We don't touch on that in this presentation, but communication is an enormous piece of it. And having this information of how things are is really critical for that communication piece. So the last step in preparing for your technology change is analyzing how things work today and then comparing that to some known pain points that folks shared with you or that the data made clear, and proposing what your future state could look like. How could things work better for you with your new technology? And I know when I say it this way, it sounds like I'm taking like the meatiest and scariest part and just saying it like it's super straightforward and simple. But I promise that by the time you've done the other steps and start putting all of the like information together, it is usually fairly straightforward what needs to happen. But one tool in your toolkit, in case you want to dig a little bit deeper, is a simple tool. It's often called a 5 why that helps you get to the root cause of a problem. And it works like this. You start with a clear picture of a problem. So it's helpful to take like a specific event that happened and look at that. So we talked about Women Rising, this, really long turnaround time for responding to the police department. Instead of saying like, hey, it can take forever for us to look up information here, you can say like, in this specific instance, when this happened, this is how long it took us. So let's look at that particular event and figure out what happened there. So you start with that picture of the problem. And then you ask why. And then you write that down. And then you keep asking, you keep drilling down to understand more about that. So tell me more about that. How come that happened? What are some of the patterns or trends? Like, how often does this happen? Is it always like this? And why or why not? And then you can dig down and dig down until you've asked so many questions about why or how come or what are the reasons for, that you've gone from the event that happened to where it fits in the broader trends of your organization to a systematic challenge, and then that's what you can propose a solution for. And again, when I say like it can be really straightforward, it's like once you get to that systematic challenge, it can be super straightforward. It's like, well, we don't have a way to look at all of this data in one place. It's like, all right, well, that's what we're going to need to solve for. So we'll get into it a little bit more in the Women's Rising example. But to review, when you need to make a new technology change, you start by preparing for it, then you implement it, and then you improve upon it. And the main steps to prepare for it are to identify the stakeholders, collect data, document how things are, analyze and propose how they should be. And there's one more thing to keep in mind as you're going through all of this. After you document the current state, you need to share that back with your stakeholders and give them an opportunity to provide corrections or caveats or weigh in on it. After you propose how you think things should be, you need to come back to your stakeholders and give them an opportunity, a meaningful opportunity to weigh in. You need to iterate. And why is iteration so important? Wouldn't it be faster to skip those steps? And wouldn't it lead to less friction? Yeah, probably. It would definitely be faster and it would certainly lead to less friction. But you're preparing for a change so that you can move on to implementing that change. And that means that one day soon, you're going to need to ask busy, potentially burned out people to stop doing things the way they've done them for years, perhaps, and do them a totally different way that may require learning something new. And that's scary and that's always tough. So, to the extent that you can involve them in creating that plan for the path forward, the easier it will be for them to adopt that change. And don't despair, because the data shows that technology changes are 4 times more likely to be successful when employees are involved in shaping that change. So, again, you definitely don't want to skip out on the iteration step. It's going to help you in the long run. All right. So we've covered the different steps in preparing for a change at a theoretical level. But let's get back to our case study and see what it actually looked like for Women Rising. When we left off, they were experiencing these really long response times to the police. They were experiencing other day-to-day inefficiencies because their client data management was bleak. And they wanted to use Salesforce, but they weren't sure how to move from those kind of dark ages of filing cabinets into the modern era. To help them prepare for the change, the first thing I did was to identify a diverse set of stakeholders at Women Rising to engage. So here's a simplified version of their org chart at the time. We've got the ED at the top. Under her is the director level, and they had 5 departments, all of which had their own teams. Again, I flattened this organization chart because it was more robust. But anyway, the departments are fundraising, fund development, administration, domestic violence, which was responsible for a broad swath of DV-related services, community economic development, which covered mostly kind of career-related programs, and finally, youth and family services, which covered a smattering of other wellness and support programs. My key counterpart on this engagement was with the director of administration. So she was obviously a stakeholder. And she suggested that we engage with the directors of DV and youth and family services. So that was kind of the starting point. Those were the stakeholders she proposed. But I knew that we needed to get a more comprehensive picture of what was going on in the organization, especially because this was such a huge leap in terms of their processes and their technology. So we really needed a lot of input to make it successful. So first we made sure that all the key programs were represented by including the director for community economic development. And then we considered that input-output model. So this helped us expand our list of stakeholders to include several folks who collect and record client data on a regular basis. So one of them was someone who staffs their hotline. One of them was a social worker who provided counseling in the Youth and Family Services Department. So by thinking in terms of who needed the information out of the system, we decided to broaden our stakeholder list to include some executive level folks who would be end users of the client data. So this included fund development, the executive director, and a board member. So all in, we had 9 key stakeholders for this project. For the collect data step, we interviewed each of them. And here's an outline of what we covered. So each interview opened with an explanation of the problem and an objective to ground the conversation. We had pre-planned a few areas of questioning that we wanted to cover with each stakeholder. So for instance, goals and needs. To better understand the goals and needs of each department, we asked questions like, if you could have any client or program information at your fingertips, what would you need to make your job easier? To understand how things actually got done, we asked questions like, walk me through your intake process. To understand strengths and pain points, we ask questions like, what's going well with your current intake process and what's not working well? And to understand more about how open they were to change, we asked things like, do you see any risks in switching to a new system? So throughout these interviews, we either explicitly asked whether that stakeholder had any access to quantitative data, or we listened in for it. So for instance, the hotline staff was able to provide their actual intake forms so that we could see exactly what information they were at least hoping to collect from every client they were intaking. The next step, document how things are. And this particular project was pretty extensive. It covered, as I mentioned, 4 major programs and each offering a really wide range of different services. So there were lots of different ways for intaking clients. But let me share one particular example from their triage line. So a client or a potential client would call the triage line and they estimated that they got about 300 calls a week. And again, this is kind of when I mentioned before, you can map out the process. I'll show you a little bit of a map here, but it's always nice to add in any quantitative data. And here's an example of doing that, this 300 calls a week number. So the triage counselor would answer and they'd introduce the organization really briefly and then understand what the client needed. And there were kind of 3 different scenarios that they found. In one scenario, the client needed services that were really out of scope for Women Rising because of geography or the type of service. So for instance, access to a food pantry. They didn't run one. In this case, the triage would provide the information directly, like here's where you can find a food pantry, or they give a phone number to refer to this other organization, and then they'd hang up the phone. And that was that. Nothing recorded, no records made. In another scenario, someone would call, the triage counselor would answer, and the potential client would request information about some kind of generally accessible services that Women's Rising provides. So, I mean, services that you don't need to go through any steps to start using it. There's no income threshold. There's no medical screening. So, like career counseling or resume reviews, those were available to anyone who asked. And so, in this case, the triage counselor would provide information, say there's an upcoming event or a job fair. They might provide a phone number to the relevant department. And then again, the call would end and no records would be made. And in the last scenario, the client would request access to services that Women's Rising could provide, but that required some sort of screening first. And in this case, the triage counselor would set up the appointment on the spot. But the only thing they'd take down was the client's name to hold the date and time. They didn't record a language preference or a zip code or any indication of the services the client might be interested in, the best way to contact the client to remind them or reschedule the appointment, or any other helpful information. So I hope you can already see the value of simply writing down what the current state looks like. Because without even asking about pain points or seeing any data about the challenges, we know that there's some opportunities here to do this, even this simple triage step, in a way that better supports the mission of the organization. So we talked a little bit about analyzing how things should be. One way that we did this was with the 5 why analysis. And so I just want to give you like a few examples of that. So we're talking about the slow response time. Why was the response time back so slow? Why was it 20 hours? Well, it was 20 hours because they weren't tracking client data and case status very well. The data was all over the place physically in terms of where it was stored in filing cabinets. It was also all over the place in terms of how it was collected. They couldn't see anything in real time or in one place. Why was that the case? Well, it was the case because they had 6 different intake processes. Whether the client was coming in via the hotline or via referrals or via walk-in, there were all different ways that even a single program could intake a client differently. At each of these different methods, they were collecting a different set of data. And then they were filing it according to that particular program. So why did they have so many different ways to track clients, and why were they collecting such different data? Well, it turns out that each program had just evolved over time what it needed. So, although they were all operating under the same umbrella, there wasn't a standardized intake process that everyone agreed on. And there was no central place to put information either. Everybody was just doing their own things, siloed. And how could it continue like that? Why was everybody still so siloed? Well, it's because no one was really owning data management. So every department just did what it needed to do to get its own work done. No one had the time or prioritized looking at that big picture. And so that is a systematic challenge that we can solve for. We can engage the teams to come up with a universal way of doing things that does a better job of meeting the organization's need. And so that's exactly what we did. So the final step, as I mentioned, in preparing for this change is analyzing. And from the interviews, we learned what sorts of data each department would need. And because we had included both the people putting in information into the system and the people taking information out of the system, we had a pretty good understanding that the sort of information we had collected and organized was pretty comprehensive. So for instance, we learned that Women Rising got we learned that there's different service categories. So we listed those out. And then for each service category, we came up with some of the information needs. So we need to know the number of clients who are getting counseling, or the number of times a client is accessing, say, a home visit, if they get 2 home visits in a month versus 1 home visit. And we also need to have an understanding of the outcomes, number of clients who got a full-time job, number of clients who got an internship or who attended an event. And then there were a few ways we really wanted to be able to slice and dice that data. So by department, which runs multiple programs in this organization, by program, by demographics, by geography, and then by time, both, year to date for the current month, trends over time, year over year. We wanted to be able to look at over time what was happening. And let me give you a couple of specific examples. So we learned that Women Rising got certain funding specific to their career services. And so they needed a way to track the total number of clients served with career support services, along with the total outcomes year over year for a particular grant. Meanwhile, the executive director was concerned if they were meeting the needs of the city's population geographically. So by recording the total number of clients they were serving, plus who was calling in to ask for support, but was maybe being referred away or just given information about an upcoming event, they were able to match that to, they also collected zip code information. So they were able to kind of look at all of those factors together to identify where the greatest unmet need was in the community and assess whether they needed to put in place any outreach efforts or partnerships to help get more coverage in that area. And that example of like, hey, if they should be recording people who are calling that they're not serving is raising any alarm bells, perhaps it's because you remember that they were recording nothing about a majority of people who were making calls to the organization. So here's a concrete example of an opportunity to improve their existing process so that when they implemented that new technology, they could use it in a way that was going to better serve their organization. And don't think I forgot the iterate step. So remember when I said that this organization is pretty complex in terms of programs and services and how they needed to track them, we did the 5 whys and we decided, hey, there needs to be a more streamlined way that they can track clients and outcomes by collecting a universal set of data. So we proposed this universal screening form and we iterated it with the stakeholders. And through those conversations, not only were we able to get folks warmed up to the idea of consolidating to a universal process, but we also got some really valuable input. So one department needed to collect demographic data using really specific verbiage and really specific categories that matched what the city was using. And the other departments didn't have the same requirements. So we could just use the city's demographic categories. In another instance, several departments hadn't mentioned in their interviews or previously, but they needed a way to track clients by case number. And they only remembered to share that when we said, hey, does this intake form looks good? And they said, oh, wait, I don't know if this is actually going to work for me. That's why the iteration step is so super important. All right. So by following these steps, identifying your stakeholders, collecting data, documenting how things are, and analyzing to propose how it should be, and iterating on it, we can lay the groundwork for a successful change to a new technology that better serves the needs of the organization and its mission. Ultimately, Women Rising made the leap out of the filing cabinet dark ages and into the modern era with Salesforce. And thanks to this thoughtful preparation, they saw a really incredible impact. They were able to cut their response times to the police from an extreme of 20 employee hours to only 30 minutes or less. They improved their grant compliance and even unlocked additional funding thanks to more consistent and granular data on the services that they were providing and their outcomes. And ultimately, this fueled growth. 3 years after successfully implementing Salesforce, it definitely was sticking and it was helping. They grew their budget and their number of clients served by about 20%. So that's concretely 1,500 more women that they were able to support with their services. That's huge. And on that happy note, I think we can pause and see if we have any questions.
That's great, Laura. This is such great information. And I'm going to also invite folks to ask questions. This is a relatively new platform for us. So for me, I am not 100% sure if people can come off mute, but if they can, please do, or type your question into the Q&A or into the chat. I will check both uh, portals, if you will. There's a Q&A portal and a chat portal, if for lack of a better word. I will check both. But in the meantime, while you all are thinking of a question, I have a question, Laura. And this is wonderful information. I love it. I love it. And I'm thinking of the fact that there's so many sizes of nonprofit organizations, and I know the framework and the steps and the wonderful operation elements that you're laying out would help organizations of all sizes, nonprofit organizations, to help with tech transformation. Um, what, if anything, might a smaller organization need to adjust with the steps or the documentation or analyzing or anything that you shared with this larger example? What, if anything, might a smaller, say, I don't know, 12-person, maybe let's say 5 to 10 staff member nonprofit, what might they need to adjust, if anything, to the process?
Great question, Susanna. So the process remains the same for any size of organization, and it's actually really helpful in a smaller organization because you have more we'll call them single points of failure, right? If you have one person who has been doing this since the organization was set up, or for a very long time, and that person leaves for whatever reason, or honestly, like goes out on a medical leave, say, those things can happen anytime. You're really not going to know how things are run. And so that current state documentation is really helpful for especially kind of earlier phase organizations, um, regardless of whether you're putting in a new technology or not. That's kind of for a risk management perspective, really helpful to have. I think, trying to think if there's anything else that varies. I think probably like the level of rigor could vary, right? Because I imagine, well, because at a smaller organization, people are wearing more hats, there's less time to devote to it. So you might have to do like a little bit more back of the envelope. But honestly, it is, you can make an awful lot of progress in just taking an hour every week, every other week, and saying, like, we're going to talk about this and figure out, we're going to prepare for our change and figure out what we need before we make the change. That's going to get you 75% of the way there. So I think you can scale it up and you can scale it down depending on the size of the organization, but the value is always there.
Awesome. Thank you. That's very hopeful for especially for those who are at the smaller organization sized organizations. And the next question we have, and everybody, I'll keep an eye on the chat and on the Q&A. If you have a question, please do type it in. Sarah writes, did Women Rising evaluate different CRMs before choosing Salesforce? Were you involved in helping them choose Salesforce?
No, I mentioned it was kind of in collaboration with their board. They chose Salesforce because Salesforce offers 10 free seats, and they were hopeful, and they ultimately did use this plan on how to manage the change and where their organization was to solicit funding for getting implementation support for Salesforce. So they actually never had to pay for the implementation either, which helped a lot. So that's kind of why they were going with Salesforce, is they had a plan to get Salesforce for free and then to get the implementation support covered by a grant, because they kind of knew where that was going. I don't personally usually do like a tech stack evaluation, but there are organizations that do. I'm aware of like a number of different CRM solutions that work particularly for nonprofits. And as I mentioned, Salesforce, I have a lot of Salesforce experience. It is a robust program. So sometimes, depending on what your needs of the organization are, you might just be okay in spreadsheets for a little while if you're a smaller organization. You might not need new technology. You might just need the existing technology to work better for you. Um, or you might need a system that's a little bit more pared down. So, something to consider. And if you're
Awesome.
interested in finding out more, like I said, I do know some folks that work specifically on evaluating tech stack needs, and I can share that with you.
That's great. That's great. Yes, Sarah, if you're interested in that, put it in the chat and or reach out to Laura as we wrap up. We are aiming for 45 minutes, and to honor everybody's time, we're pretty much at that point. Before we wrap up, Laura, I'll ask you to share your contact information again so people can reach out if they do have those questions. Ah, there it is.
Yeah,
And
I'll breeze through this super quick. But again, my name's Laura Leonard. We support nonprofits with the people and process side of tech implementations, from preparing for the change, implementing the change, and providing any sort of one-off advisory support or ongoing. So please reach out if you have any questions or you have any needs. And my contact information is here. And I just wanted to say thank you to Susanna and for TechSoup Connect for having me.
we are so thrilled that you are here, Laura, and your presentation was so high level and clear and engaging, and upbeat. And we're just so grateful for the information that you shared with us. And so, everybody, please take down Laura's information there. You can see it on the screen, and I shared the link to her website in the chat. And everybody, remember to keep your eye on TechSoup Connects Austin chapters page, or however you find out about our upcoming events. We'd love to see you at one soon. And thanks again, everybody, for coming. Have a great day.